The crowd roars as the lights dim, casting a shadow over the octagon. In one corner stands the undefeated, unshakable force of MMA Khabib Nurmagomedov, the man who dominated the lightweight division and left the sport without a single blemish on his record. In the other corner, a giant looms, a legend from a different world where scripted fights still require real pain and where towering figures dominate the stage. Kane, the masked monster of WWE, a man whose mere presence strikes fear into his opponents. The energy in the air is thick, a clash of two worlds, one built on raw combat, the other on spectacle and power. No one in the arena knows what to expect. This isn't just another fight. This is a battle of fighting philosophies, a contest between pure technique and sheer brute force. For years, fans debated the ultimate question: how would a professional wrestler fare against an elite MMA fighter? Kane, known for his terrifying presence in the ring, had never truly been tested in a real fight under MMA rules. His choke slams and tombstone piledrivers thrilled millions, but now he stood against a man who had humbled some of the greatest fighters in the world with nothing more than relentless pressure and an unbreakable will. Khabib had faced warriors, champions, and legends. But never had he stood across from someone like this, a man who seemed more like a myth than a fighter. The clash was set, but the outcome was anything but certain. It all started with a challenge that was never supposed to be taken seriously. The internet buzzed when a clip surfaced of Kane in an interview, laughing off a hypothetical matchup against an MMA fighter. "They may be tough," he had said, his voice carrying the deep, menacing growl fans knew so well, "but put them in the ring with me, and we'll see who gets back up." It was the kind of statement that got people talking. Fans of both sports took sides, some dismissing the idea as absurd, others calling for a fight to settle it once and for all. At first, it was just noise, another fantasy matchup that would never happen. But the clip made its way to Khabib, and his response was different from what anyone expected. Instead of ignoring it, he smiled, shook his head, and said, "I wrestle beers. You think I'm scared of big guys?" The comment was lighthearted, but the world took notice. In a sport where size often dictated the fight, Khabib had never been one to back down. The undefeated champion had always believed that technique and discipline could overcome strength. And now people wondered, what if? What if Khabib stepped into the cage against someone twice his size? Could his legendary grappling break the unbreakable? Could he take down a man built like a nightmare? The curiosity turned into demand, and demand turned into negotiations. The moment the fight was officially announced, it felt surreal. Kane, the 7-foot monster of WWE, had agreed to step into an MMA cage, stepping out of the scripted world and into the most unforgiving arena in combat sports. But Kane wasn't coming just for a payday. He had something to prove. For years, professional wrestlers had been mocked by real fighters, dismissed as actors rather than athletes. To Kane, this was more than just a fight. It was a statement. If he won, it would silence the doubters forever. And if he lost, that wasn't an option he was willing to consider. The night of the fight arrived faster than anyone expected. The build-up had been intense. Kane had been training in secret, working with professional fighters, adapting his raw power into something more dangerous. His striking, once slow and exaggerated for the entertainment of WWE fans, had been sharpened into something far more lethal. Khabib, meanwhile, had done what he always did, trained with the same intensity that made him unbeatable. He had studied Kane's movements, broken down his weaknesses, and prepared for the impossible. But no matter how much tape he watched, there was no real blueprint for fighting someone like Kane. No one had ever tried. The cage door shut. The referee signaled the start. The crowd was on its feet, unsure of what was about to happen. Kane towered over Khabib, his reach massive, his fists looking like they could end the fight with a single clean shot. Khabib bounced on his feet, light, calculating, eyes locked on his opponent. The first move would be everything. If Kane caught him early, it could all be over in seconds. If Khabib got in close, the fight could take a very different turn. The air was electric. Then, Kane raised his massive hands, stepping forward with a kind of deliberate pace that made men freeze in fear. Khabib, always fearless, took a deep breath and prepared to do what he had done his entire career: break his opponent's will. But then, something unexpected happened. Kane didn't lunge. But then, something unexpected happened. Kane didn't lunge. He didn't swing wildly. He just smiled. And in that moment, Khabib realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary fight. This was something else entirely. Khabib's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to move, to react. But something about Kane's posture, his eerie stillness, sent a different kind of chill through him. He had faced wrestlers, strikers, submission specialists, fighters of every kind, but never someone like this. Kane wasn't just massive. He carried himself like an unstoppable force, an immovable object. And that smile. It wasn't the expression of a man sizing up an opponent. It was something else, something far more unsettling. Was it confidence? Mockery? Or had Kane been holding something back? Something no one, not even Khabib, had anticipated. The tension in the air thickened as Kane took another step forward, his massive hands slowly curling into fists. The audience, thousands packed into the arena, barely made a sound. They didn't know what to expect, and neither did Khabib. He feinted, testing Kane's reactions, but the towering fighter barely moved. This wasn't the reckless, theatrical aggression of a professional wrestler. Kane was patient, calculating, and that was dangerous. Khabib knew that in any fight, hesitation could be fatal. He had to make his move. With the speed of a man half his size, Khabib shot forward, closing the distance in an instant. His goal was clear: get in, lock Kane's legs, and take him to the ground. That was where Khabib had always been strongest, where he had crushed opponents with relentless grappling, smothering them under the weight of his technique. But the moment he made contact, he felt something was wrong. Kane didn't budge. It was like running into a wall of steel. Khabib had taken down Olympic wrestlers, world champions, men with seemingly unbreakable bases, but this was different. Kane didn't just resist, he absorbed the impact, his balance unshaken. Then, in one swift, terrifying motion, Kane's arms wrapped around Khabib's body, and before the undefeated champion could react, he was lifted off his feet. The crowd gasped as Kane hoisted Khabib into the air, holding him there effortlessly, as if the Dagestani warrior weighed nothing. The grip was suffocating, crushing, unlike anything Khabib had felt before. He had been trapped before, had fought out of impossible positions, but this wasn't technique. It was raw, overwhelming strength. And for the first time in years, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Khabib recalled the stories. The legends of Kane's impossible strength, the way he had tossed around men nearly as big as him in the wrestling ring. But those had been scripted fights, choreographed performances. Hadn't they? Khabib struggled, twisting, trying to free himself, but Kane held on, tightening his grip like a constrictor snake. For a moment, it felt like Khabib might be slammed to the canvas, and if that happened, He wasn't sure how or if he'd recover. Then, with a sudden burst of technique, Khabib shifted his weight, using Kane's own strength against him. It wasn't easy. Every muscle in his body strained against the grip, but he managed to slip free just enough to drop back to his feet. Kane reacted instantly, throwing a massive punch aimed straight at Khabib's head. The crowd roared as Khabib barely ducked in time, feeling the force of the strike whistle past his ear. If that had landed, he didn't even want to think about it. Stepping back, Khabib recalibrated. This wasn't going to be like his past fights. Kane wasn't just strong, he was smart. He wasn't blindly swinging or relying on his size alone. He was waiting, watching, learning. That was dangerous. Khabib had spent his career breaking down opponents piece by piece, but now, for the first time in a long time, he was the one being studied. On the other side of the cage, Kane cracked his neck, that same eerie smile still on his face. He wasn't winded, wasn't frustrated. He was enjoying this. That realization sent another jolt of unease through Khabib. Most of his opponents, no matter how confident they were before the fight, eventually cracked under his pressure. But Kane? Kane wasn't breaking. If anything, he looked like he was just getting started. Outside the cage, the world watched in stunned silence. Fans who had doubted Kane's ability were starting to wonder. Was he more dangerous than anyone had given him credit for? Did he have something hidden beneath the persona, something that had never been tested in a real fight? On the other side, Khabib's supporters still believed in their champion, but even they couldn't deny it. This was unlike any fight he had ever faced. Then, as if reading Khabib's mind, Kane did something unexpected. He stepped back and waited. He wasn't pressing the attack, wasn't charging forward like a reckless brawler. He was inviting Khabib to make the next move. That was when the realization hit. Kane wasn't just testing his power. He was testing Khabib's mind, his strategy. And that made him far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Khabib narrowed his eyes, adjusting his stance. If this was a battle of wits as much as strength, then he would play his game too. He had faced adversity before. He had fought against impossible odds and still come out victorious. But this time felt different. And as the two fighters stared each other down, the question hung in the air. Was this the fight that Khabib couldn't win? The tension in the cage had reached a boiling point. Khabib had always been the one who dictated the pace of a fight, the one who forced his opponents into uncomfortable positions. But this time, he wasn't in control. Kane wasn't chasing him, wasn't rushing forward with reckless aggression. He was standing there, patient, measured, waiting for Khabib to make his move. That was when Khabib realized something that sent a chill down his spine. Kane wasn't just trying to win. He was enjoying this. He wasn't fighting out of desperation or ego. He was fighting because he wanted to see what Khabib was truly capable of. Khabib circled to his right, testing angles, searching for an opening. Kane's footwork wasn't as slow as expected, and that made things even more complicated. A fighter that big shouldn't have been able to move like that. Every calculated step Khabib took was matched with one of Kane's own, a dance of violence where neither man was willing to take the first misstep. Then, in a split-second decision, Khabib feinted left and exploded forward. His plan was simple: close the distance, get under Kane's reach, and force the fight to the ground. It was a strategy that had worked against elite wrestlers, world-class strikers, and submission specialists alike. But as soon as he closed the gap, Kane did something that no one, not even Khabib, had expected. Instead of sprawling to defend the takedown or backing away, Kane leaned into Khabib's momentum. He didn't resist, he absorbed. And then, in a move that defied logic, Kane turned the tables. He shifted his weight at the perfect moment, using Khabib's own attack against him. The next thing Khabib knew, he wasn't driving Kane backward. He was airborne. Kane had countered the takedown with an almost effortless throw, something no one had ever done to Khabib before. The moment stretched into eternity. The ground rushed toward him faster than he could react, and before he could adjust his position, he crashed down hard. The crowd gasped. Khabib had been taken down. Khabib, the man who had mauled world champions on the ground, was now the one underneath his opponent. Kane loomed over him, a shadow of raw power and control. This wasn't supposed to happen. Kane was supposed to struggle on the ground. He was supposed to be out of his element here. But he wasn't. He was calm. He was composed. And worst of all, he was laughing. Khabib gritted his teeth. He wasn't going to panic. He had been in bad positions before, had fought through adversity and emerged victorious every time. But this was different. Kane's weight was immense, his balance unnaturally strong. Khabib tried to shift, to sweep, but Kane planted his massive hands on the mat and held firm. This wasn't just strength, this was calculated control. And that's when it hit Khabib. Kane had been preparing for this. The internet had mocked Kane when the fight was announced. Critics had laughed at the idea of a WWE superstar stepping into an MMA cage. But Kane hadn't just been training to survive. He had been training to win. He had studied Khabib's game, broken down his tendencies, and found a way to counter them. This wasn't a desperate attempt to prove himself. This was a calculated strategy. And now, Khabib was on the wrong end of it. The undefeated champion knew he had to act fast. If he let Kane establish full control, it could be disastrous. Using every ounce of technique, Khabib shifted, isolating Kane's arm just enough to create an opening. It was a small gap, barely there, but it was all he needed. In one explosive motion, Khabib twisted, creating just enough space to escape. He scrambled back to his feet, and the crowd erupted. But something was different. Kane didn't seem frustrated. He didn't seem shaken. If anything, he looked impressed. He tilted his head slightly, studying Khabib as if he had just confirmed something he had been wondering all along. Khabib's breathing was controlled, but his mind was racing. He had escaped, but at what cost? For the first time, he wasn't sure what Kane's next move would be. The masked giant had already done the impossible once. Who was to say he wouldn't do it again? Then, Kane did something even stranger. He took a step back and removed his mask. The crowd gasped. This was no longer the character that fans knew from WWA. This was the man underneath, the real fighter who had spent years hidden behind the persona. And now, Khabib wasn't just fighting an opponent, he was fighting someone who had something to prove. Someone who had never been seen in this light before. Someone who had kept his true self hidden until now. Khabib clenched his fists. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to survive. The tension in the air was suffocating. The mask lay on the canvas, forgotten, as Kane stood barefaced, revealing the man behind the legend. His eyes burned with something deeper than just the desire to win. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, this fight, his entire life. Khabib had faced countless warriors, had broken champions with his relentless style, but this was different. This wasn't just an opponent. This was a force of nature, something unpredictable, something that defied logic. Khabib tightened his stance, his mind racing through strategies. He had escaped once, but Kane had already proved he could counter the seemingly unstoppable. This was no longer about wrestling, striking, or even skill. This was about who wanted it more. Kane moved first, stepping forward with surprising speed, launching a massive right hand. Khabib barely managed to slip to the side, feeling the sheer force of the punch slice through the air. He knew he couldn't afford to take a clean shot like that. Kane's power was terrifying, but power alone had never beaten Khabib. With lightning reflexes, Khabib shot in for another takedown, but this time he adjusted. Instead of going straight for Kane's waist, he faked low, then exploded upward, wrapping his arms around Kane's upper body. It was a risky move. Grappling with a man that size could backfire, but it was his best chance. He shifted his weight, using every ounce of leverage, and with a roar, he lifted Kane off the ground. The crowd erupted. No one had ever seen something like this. For a brief moment, Kane was weightless, and then BAM. Khabib slammed him into the mat with all the force he could muster. The arena shook. Kane's back hit the canvas, and for the first time in the fight, he looked stunned. Khabib wasted no time. He scrambled into position, locking Kane's arm, his grip tightening like steel. He wasn't going for control anymore. He was going for the finish. The submission was locked in, the pressure unbearable. Khabib had ended fights with this before, and this time was no different. Kane struggled, his massive frame twisting, but Khabib had him trapped. The seconds dragged on, and the crowd held its breath. Would he tap? Could he escape? Then, something no one expected happened. Kane's free hand lifted, not in surrender, but in a slow, deliberate motion. And then he tapped. The referee rushed in, waving his arms. It was over. The fight was over. Khabib had won. The crowd exploded, the noise deafening. Khabib rolled off, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. But he didn't celebrate. He didn't jump onto the cage or scream in triumph. Instead, he turned to Kane, meeting his gaze. Kane sat up, breathing heavily. Then, he did something that stunned everyone. He smiled. Not a smile of defeat, but one of respect. He reached out his hand, and without hesitation, Khabib took it. The two warriors stood, face to face, and the moment felt bigger than the fight itself. This wasn't about victory or loss anymore. It was about something far greater: mutual respect, the acknowledgement of true warriors who had pushed each other beyond their limits. As the cameras flashed and the announcer made it official, Kane leaned in and whispered something to Khabib. No one but them would ever know what was said, but the look in Khabib's eyes changed. He nodded, a small smirk appearing on his face. And just like that, the moment was gone. The fight was over, but the legend had only just begun.